as Pete said, I run one of the brands called Pretzel Lab at Mantle Group. We do product and design, and we really like asking the question, what's the point of building something if no one's going to use it? So Dan and I thought this would be pretty interesting here at a place where I think you build a lot of things and sometimes people don't use them, and that's really sad. I think before we go into intros, one of the things that Dan and I wanted to do in this talk is go back to first principles about DevOps and how that works and where it comes from. And a lot of our work in the past has been grounded in that. One of my favourite things about DevOps isn't just the build it, run it principle, but actually there's this kind of deep satisfaction, I think, that everybody gets, designers, product people, and specifically engineers, when you see somebody using your product, right? When you see somebody using the thing that you built, and it's bringing them joy or it's making their job better. So hopefully the stuff that we talk through today will give you some inspiration. What do you do, Dan?
So I am a software engineer, but I'm technology obsessed. But I do like to see people use the things that I build. Like, that gives me a lot of joy if I find out someone's using something that I've built. When I started in software engineering, I thought it was sitting alone writing code, and I was happy to do that for the next 30 years of my career or so. Turns out that's not the case, and I meet people like Jane who explain to me, what do you do, Jane?
Well, oddly, I thought solving problems was an individual sport too, because I would be very happy sitting in the corner by myself solving complex problems. But I spend a lot of time helping people understand that solving complex problems is a team sport. So looking at different ways to enable teams to get the best outcome for their customers, for their organisations, and for their employees. That's what I do. Sort of.
Yeah, and that
Maybe.
makes sense. So Jane and I work together a lot in the business, and in our area of the business, it's about improving customer experiences and improving customer adoption of those experiences. Having a technologist like myself in what traditionally is thought of as a design and product business might seem strange and odd, but it's awesome and it works really well. And what we want to share here a lot is those experiences. We do a surprising amount of work with customers for internal products and internal platforms. And we want to share a lot of, I guess, what we've learned through that process, but all of the, the approaches and tools that we have in our toolkit that we use that we want to share today.
Who's seen this before? And does anybody know what this is called? It's on the slide. Yeah, it's called a desire line or desire path. So you can see somebody's put a lot of effort into building the lovely concreted safe path around it. And you can see that people are really fucking annoyed. Oh, they already did it. And they just walk straight through it. So this is called a desire path, and this happens everywhere, in the actual world, in the physical world, and in the digital world, whether that's digital apps or whether that's platforms. You've got to understand what people do. So what we do in our team is we look at trying to understand what is it that people actually want or need. You can see here, I don't know if you can see that from the back there, but you can see just behind the light post there's a very lightly trodden path, right? And if we spend a little bit more time observing what they do, that path becomes a more well-trodden path, right? And then if we observe a little bit more, again, I don't know if you can see this, but now we've actually shored up the path. The path is both concreted and has a fence, which means there's safety rails in there. And so this is a pretty good metaphor for the type of thing that we call the adoption curve. This is how people actually use spaces and specifically software.
That's great, Jane, but this is a DevOps conference.
Awkward. What does this have to do with... Tell me, Dan, what does this have to do with platforms?
Well, there's a lot of discussion at the moment, and people have been doing this for many years, but we're still finding our way around how we can treat platforms that we build for our internal customers, how we treat them as products, and what does that mean for the way we work, the way we engage the people that we build things for. But for us, it's about how we can apply all the things that we know about how we build good, digital experiences for consumers How do we apply those for our internal platforms as well?
So I guess we're going to touch on a bunch of concepts. Some of you may be familiar, some of you may not. And the way that we talk about them, we'll refer through our talk today kind of pretty frequently. So on the right here, this is what we call the adoption curve, and I'll kind of talk through each of the parts of that in a minute. And what we tend to couple the adoption curve with is what we call pirate metrics over here. So if you use your imagination on the pirate metrics, you'll see that A, R, and R, it says R.
It's the worst.
Excellent.
Keep that in mind later.
Keep that in mind. So we're going to refer to that for a lot. So the pirate metrics are basically about the conversion funnel. How do I convert people to use my thing, whether, again, that's a digital thing or a platform thing, an internal thing. But the people that we're talking about, this is what we call the adoption curve. And the adoption curve represents, for want of a better description, a timeline-ish of how your product should evolve to capture your entire market share. Does that make sense? So on the left here, we've got what we call the innovators and the early adopters. The innovators and the early adopters resemble you, typically. They are the ones that probably have the same kinds of problems that you're having with whatever the problem is, specifically internally, right? This is what we call, this group of people here are very willing to give you lots and lots of feedback because they're happy with an imperfect product or solution to their problem because their problem is so big. Then we have a thing called the chasm. This is true of pretty much every single digital startup that you can imagine and every product that is ever released in every service. If you don't think about how to cross the chasm, you will never get to the early majority. Right? And if you remember the picture about the desire paths, if you don't think about the gates, the safety, the security, the surety that the early majority need, then you'll never cross the chasm. This is where most products go to die. That's what they talk about in kind of the startup world. But you can see the number, the percentage is important here. So the innovators, these people feel like you, but that is literally only 15% of your total market share of 100. Your early majority and your late majority represent, I don't know, by definition, I guess, the majority. And they're the hardest to get on board because they're people. All right. Oh.
Yeah, you talk about this a lot. And I think it's really useful in this context.
So this is actually, this for those who are familiar with it, you normally see this as a Venn diagram. User desirability, tech feasibility, and business viability. But it turns out if you take that Venn diagram, you squish it down a little bit and you stick some arrows on it, it looks just like a pretzel, which is what we're labelled. That's our namesake. So I think with digital products, it's very easy to use this Venn diagram or this pretzel to say, I understand and I'll do a whole bunch of customer research and whatnot to understand what my users actually want. And then I'll do some tech feasibility. And we have product people who go off and do business viability. That's a pretty standard practice for digital products. When you're building an internal platform, and specifically like if you were part of a big bank, for example, and you needed to re-platform the API platform, right? You need to rebuild that API platform. It's a lot harder to think about what the user wants because someone just told you to do it. And so it's really about tech feasibility. The focus is on tech feasibility because you have to modernize, you have to uplift, it has to do all of these other things. So we focus a lot on technical feasibility, technical build, and it's probably more interesting to be honest, than doing these other two things. But it turns out that you will have a lot more success. One of my clients is one of the banks, and they asked us to help them rebuild the API platform. And I said, how many platforms do you have that have less than 10 users on them? And they said, probably like 15. Wow, that's a lot. For a big bank, that's a lot. Those platforms, as I'm sure everybody in this room knows, right? Like, they're not short to build. A lot of time and effort goes into that, and only 10 people using it. Is that really worth it? Question mark.
How much did it cost for each user?
Oh,
don't work it out.
I don't even want to think about it. So, I actually really like this. While we were prepping for this talk, I did some Googling, and I found this blog by this guy, Tom, and I think he articulates this very well. This is his post about platforms as a product. And I think that this resonates with Dan and I because your platforms have users, right? Or customers, same. It's long-lived. Like most platforms, I mean, with the amount of effort it takes to build them, I'm pretty sure they're there to last. And they need to evolve. They certainly should evolve. I think that's probably why we're replacing a bunch of them, right? So I won't read it all out, but I thought this was really nice. A nice way to represent, I think, and hopefully resonates with you about your internal platforms.
Cool. So I think we've set the scene a bit about what we're trying to do here. Now let's try and apply some of those approaches and techniques to platforms. I think starting with an analogy we all know, but may have sometimes forgotten, is actually quite interesting. So this is the first iPhone here. I can remember it didn't have copy and paste. I can remember everyone was screaming it didn't have a hardware keyboard, and people were never going to use that screen. I forgot you couldn't actually send MMSs with the first phone, but it launched, and of course we see where it is today. It was a visionary platform. It was launched short of tactical features that had people screaming, but Apple were visionary enough to see where they're going to take it. Then we see that chasm crossing there in 2010 with FaceTime and iMessage. What that created was a network effect. So it became more valuable as a platform the more people that used it, and the more people that used it, it created more value. And so using those two things, it's really interesting to reflect back onto your own work and what you're trying to build as platforms internally to support your teams and to support your engineers. What are the copy and paste features that you could probably hold back and actually get something out to people sooner rather than later? What's the network effects within your environment so you could actually start to find ways that your platforms become more valuable because you've got more people using them, and then because there's more people using them, your platforms can become more valuable. So try and find analogies like this, use these tools, and then play them back into your own environment so you can think, what's my copy and paste? What's my network effect? What's my iMessage that's going to get people using this a lot more? Maybe it's, there's more skills within the team, and if there's more skills within the team, then there's more community, there's more ability to move between projects because everyone knows how to use your platform within the environment. I'd suggest that's a good place to start for network effects.
Before you go on, I think the other thing that's interesting about this for your platform is what happened in 2016.
So one here.
Right here. So this is this group of people called the late majority. So one of the things that's interesting about I guess we take the people lens, unsurprising for me, right? So these are the innovators. These are who we like the innovators. They're the Apple fanboys, right? These are the Apple fanboys that don't want to pay straight away, but still willing to line up overnight, right?
Yep.
Over here, these are the people who are like, fuck, $2,500, I'm not paying that, or whatever it was originally, right? And I can't call my mum this way. So that's basically kind of how we categorize them. But what happened is, the thing that's probably important about the SE for Apple and how you should think about your platforms is you don't have to create a product that is everything to everyone. It's pretty unlikely that you will build a product that will, in fact, service what we call the late majority and the laggards. And Apple knew that. So in 2016, they released the SE, which is a simpler version, cheaper and simpler version of the phone. It's built on the same kind of concepts, of course. They have a lot of reuse, but that effectively created a second adoption curve for them. So they took that market and they took it out of the main iPhone play. Does that make sense? And so you can do that with your platforms too. I think what's hard internally is that you're kind of trying to service all the masters. But what you really have to do is prioritize your masters and figure out, what are you going to do at this point? This is probably the hardest point. So, why is it so hard to cross the chasm? What do you think, Dan?
Oh, well, because it feels so good at the start. You've got all your innovators and all your early adopters around you saying, gee, I love what you've built. This is exactly what I need. It's only 15% of who you actually need to tap into, but it feels great. Everyone says it works. You've got your 10 users using it. You spend a year building it. It feels great. But beyond that point, which you do need to get to, because for it to have payback, for it to give you that leverage in your organisation where, okay, we've spent a year with a team of 10 people building this, we can't have 5 users using it. How do we get the rest of that majority onto the platform? Turns out the rest of that majority, they don't look to their early adopters to say, I'll do whatever you do. Turns out actually that turns them off because they say, we're the majority, we've got a different risk profile, we're actually a bit more risk adverse. So whatever they do, we're going to do the opposite. And that doesn't lend itself to naturally moving through that system there. So you have to find ways to actually cross that chasm, as it were.
Oh, we said I wasn't going to choke.
Oh, you're choking.
I guess we lied.
Fine. So Crossing the Chasm is actually a book called Crossing the Chasm, written quite a long time ago. It's very worth reading. It does feel like, it might be marketing and just business speak, but you need to stop and then think, okay, maybe I can apply some of this in my domain as well. One of the great techniques around crossing the chasm is finding a beachhead. So someone within that majority who starts to show a spark of getting it. If you can land on that beachhead, as you might in a war situation, and set up camp, then you've got someone in that environment that everyone else in that majority can start to rally around and go, well, maybe if this person who's the same as me and has the same risk profile will start to use my tools, then maybe the rest of your organisation as well. That's just one tip. There's a whole suite of them in Crossing the Chasm as well.
So, I think it's actually really important to think about the risk profile, especially in an internal organisation. So the main reason that people fail crossing the chasm is because people are really fucking annoying. Because you try and get them to walk on a path and they just want to go wherever it's like herding sheep, basically. So you've got to figure out what they want, but more importantly, you've got to figure out what they need, right? And so as Dan said, the risk profile on this side is very different to the risk profile on this side. And the risk conservation goes down, right? People are less risky as we go down. So here are a couple of things that we're going to talk through, including how to approach people. So we've got local optimization versus global optimization, and how does that affect you? We've got the Innovators Dilemma, and how does that affect you? We've got, don't forget your why. What is your mission and purpose? And then we've still got people.
And we've still got people.
And we've still got people.
Looking at this feels like a lot of abstract kind of business speak. What we really want to do is try and make this tangible for you. So I'm trying to use examples of both things we know, products we know, digital products, but also translate it back into our own environment and our own day-to-day as well, because it is possible without kind of getting caught too much in the dogma of what some of these things are. I think one of the points we wanted to make with a lot of these are just tools in your toolkit. These aren't dogma that you need to follow 100% and ignore anything else. This is about applying critical thinking to your context and go, does this make sense? If it doesn't, don't use it. But if it starts to make sense and help you work through it, then maybe it's useful for you to apply as well. Let's jump into some of them. So I assume a lot of you have seen this Start With a Why before. Have you seen that short clip from Simon Sinek talking about Start With a Why? Like, it's really powerful. The way he delivers it, particularly, God, I sound like an Apple fanboy, particularly talking about Apple, is really, really useful. When you don't start with the why, and you start with, look, we make beautifully designed things, they're computers, do you want to buy one? It's kind of not as powerful. But when he starts with, look, we aim to think differently. We want to challenge the status quo. Now, my ears pricked up. Oh, okay, I'm interested now. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to make things user-friendly and beautiful. What do you do again? Oh, we make computers. Do you want to buy one? That's kind of the pitch. Now, apply that same kind of approach to how you, when you've created, say, a set of tools or some pipelines or some APIs or any of those things, how can we approach our users of those things in that same way? To say, well, why did you create this suite of APIs for me? What was the point of that? As opposed to just trying to say, hey, here's how you log in with this new API now.
So I think there's a couple of things. I'll throw out a couple of really old cliche statements here. So I think one, I think the why, and we'll talk about Simon and Apple, and actually Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was relentless in sticking to his why. He knew exactly where he wanted that to go from a visionary perspective. That was his mission and his purpose for that product. He was very willing to pivot quickly, but he was willing to test in market, which a lot of people think was a bit controversial, because I think he's controversially well known for saying, why would I test with users? So I think in this, what Steve did very well is test in market, because it was very difficult for people to conceptualize something that they didn't have a mental model for, right? What did he say? Like, if I just asked people, they would want like more iPods or like, yeah, with
Physical
the hard
keyboard.
keyboards or physical keyboards or whatever. He's like, that's not the feedback that I want, because they don't understand what I'm trying to do, right? And so when we're thinking about like your proof of concepts and all of that sort of thing, that's what Steve was really, really good at, that he was willing to invest probably a lot more money than our organisations. I think the other thing that people kind of fall into the trap on here is kind of the build it and they will come, right? So we've got a solution and we're going to go find some problems that we can solve with it. I figured one of those would resonate. So how does this apply to people, and why are they so annoying in this process? Well, it turns out even if, it doesn't matter which approach you take, to be honest, you still have to go and get people to want your thing or have the same problem. And it turns out this room is a room of engineers, not a room of marketers. But if you're building an internal product, part of your job is to market your product, which is your platform. Who knew that was in your job description? Most of the people I work with didn't.
Yeah, it was a realisation for me when I started an open source project with a guy called Gavin King. Does anyone know Hibernate? Is anyone old enough?
Yes.
Great, thank you for making me not feel so bad.
No worries.
We thought it was great. Everything out there around object relational mapping tools was crap. We created something that was much better. We open sourced to put it out there and waited, and no one downloaded it. And we were really confused because it was way better than what was out there. And we iterated on it. We came and talked at events like this, and people started to get interested in it. But what we soon found out is that we had to interact with people, and the way we got adoption of that, and the way that really accelerated at the start, was to focus on two things. One was responding to forum posts straight away, and not writing code, even though that's all we wanted to do. So we would respond to forum posts straight away. The other one was documentation and examples of how to use every single feature. If a feature was in the code base that wasn't documented and had an example, it didn't exist. And not only did it exist, that piece of code was actually costing us time. It was dragging us back. And so those two things in the early days actually got us a long way to where we could actually support a bigger community that actually did believe and understand what we're doing. So sometimes the thing is not to bury yourself in the code and just get that done. Sometimes it's to go out there and answer questions and talk to people.
So as we go down, we've got activation, retention, referral, revenue, pirate metrics. The thing about getting someone to log on to your platform or use your platform, that makes a lot of sense because you've kind of done your marketing. Retention is about keeping them on it. And so in an organisation where you have no choice but to use that platform, that's easy. Actually, acquisition, activation and retention, really easy in that space. But remember, in the banks where you're probably replacing a whole bunch of platforms, it takes a really long time to replace them, so both platforms at least live in coexistence for at least 3 years. You have choice. And when consumers or users have choice, you have to convince them to use yours. Not only do you have to convince them to use yours, acquisition, you have to convince them to stay on yours. So that's retention. And then, Dan, you talked a little bit before about kind of who are the people that are going to be your advocates. Who are the people that are going to say, oh my God, sitting next to the person next to them, you should use this, it's better than the other one. Because you obviously can create an amplifier effect. Turns out that is really hard to do when all you want to do is focus on building a really good product or platform.
All right, I'm excited to start talking about this because systems thinking is something that I've been seeing applied in everywhere, and I'm not a DevOps engineer, but every time I dig into that world and talking with Peter recently, like understanding how foundational this is for the DevOps movement has been really exciting for me because it's been really foundational for the work that we do, and it's foundational for a lot of educators as well. So it's a broad some broad thinking that I think it's really worth coming back and reminding ourselves of what are the first principles of why we're here and the way we do things. So people refer to Deming quite a lot. He's got so many just beautiful quotes. It's hard to choose. You've almost got to pick randomly because they're just beautiful. The book is hard to get through. The New Economics is excellent though. As an audio book, it's great, but it has a lot of formulas in it as well. So hearing someone read out formulas in audio is not exciting at all, where you can just kind of flip pages. But there's an alternative. So Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows is actually really, really accessible. I'd recommend that. So if you've got a desire to think a bit more about the foundations of the DevOps movement and where it came from in systems thinking, Deming seems a little bit of a stretch too far. Have a look at Donella's book as well. But there's a whole suite of those things out there as well that I really, really encourage you to take a look at.
So this feels like a messy slide, probably because systems thinking is a little bit messy, to be honest, like really simple and really messy and complex at the same time. So I guess what we wanted to do is just reiterate that what we often think is our ecosystem is usually bigger than what we think, right? So I'll talk to the picture in the top left here, if that's left. Yep, good. Yeah. So I think sometimes we forget the enormity of the entire ecosystem. That's kind of the whole organisation fitting together. But we also have to put that in context, right? So if you're in a team in the little grey circle on the far left here, knowing the overall context of how the organisation works is really important. But understanding the influences of your particular system, which is the grey bubble and the yellow bubble, they're the most important things. But we can easily get distracted by what's happening in the little grey bubble. That's what we call local optimization, right? And if you think about this, if you visualize like a series of if they were a series of cogs, that little grey cog that's the little cog. You can optimize that cog as much as you want, can spin really fast, but your whole system will only go as fast as that big cog. Because that's how that works. The whole ecosystem kind of fits together that way. Does that make sense? So when we're looking at platforms and people and the context of what they fit in, we have to understand the influences that kind of connect everything, which is why I think systems thinking is an awesome kind of part of this. But then we have to apply it in context. What can you do? What can you influence? And how will you go about that?
Oh God, another book, another business management book, sorry.
Dan?
I guarantee you this will be a useful read. Clayton Christensen, obviously a brilliant guy. But again, I think this is really useful for back to what we do at the moment. So the Innovators Dilemma basically says that great companies tend to fail when disruptive technologies come along because they're doing the rational thing. They look at their business, it's successful, it's stable. Why would they suddenly take a risk with something else when they see what they're doing is safe? They're doing the rational thing. That's the dilemma. How do you do both of those things? For us, this is very real. So we're working with a big resources company at the moment, and they've come to us and said, why won't cloud be adopted across our organisation? There's a section of us that are big advocates for it. The rest of the organisation is saying, we're fine how we are, thanks. Just leave us on bare metal and everything will be great. And you know what? That's actually quite rational for that majority to say because nothing's broken there at the moment. It's working. Why should they suddenly adopt this different world at the moment? And I know a lot of, probably particularly in this room, go, what? Why is there anyone on that at the moment? But it's what happens. And I think things like the Innovators Dilemma can help us understand and get in the shoes of those folks who are thinking rationally. But then what's awesome about what Clayton produced and what some people don't talk about a lot is he's actually got another book called The Innovator's Solution, thank God. Because when I first read this, I'm like, oh, well, we're all doomed. Like, the Innovator's Solution has a few things that are really good tips that we can look into. Like, make sure when you're building something, build it not necessarily for your current customers, but maybe the right customers. Who is the right set of people in this organisation to go and find and build this for? Not, okay, this is the team I'm working with at the moment, you're going to use cloud. They're going to hate it. Find a spark in a cloud that are interested in this.
Just coming back to that company, so we actually applied design and product thinking to their cloud adoption approach. So we went and took the adoption curve and we showed them what it meant from a cloud adoption perspective. We asked them to segment their target customers, which turns out to be the technology group. Great. We interviewed their customers to understand what was prohibiting people from moving across the chasm. What was prohibiting the early majority? It turns out, we found out that they wanted a better governance document. They wanted better understanding of the support model. So if I hire the people into my team, well, actually, that one was more like, if something breaks, my expectation is I can call you and you'll fix it. And they were like, no, that's not us. We're just here to build things. Then there's the skills, like, do you hire the people into your team and we use them, or do we hire the people into our team, but you pay for them because they're cloud people, not our people, right? So these questions, and working with our client in that particular space, they were like, it took a little while, but they got there. They realized that they were on the left of the chasm. They were like, we've been building this whole cloud platform thinking that everybody was going to want to use it just like we did. And over here in the security and integration space, they were like, what? We don't want to use that. On-prem safer, right under my desk. I don't think so. This whole, you tell me what your workload placement thingamajiggy is, and I'll consider thinking about it. That's what it came down to, right? So putting that in super practical terms for you, like that's what our interviews of the customers did. We didn't have to interview 200 people. We interviewed 20.
All right, Jane, you've got a couple of minutes to explain your pirates.
Okay. Hopefully you've been following the thread, but this analogy, it's kind of hard to follow. So basically, what we're talking about here is when you're looking at building your product, there's a bunch of lenses that you have to think about. So if you're on this pirate ship, because we have pirate metrics.
It's not funny at all.
It's funny. Oh, man, do you know how hard it was to build this? So the first thing is, if you're on this ship, you're heading to your North Star, you need someone to be looking straight down. Because if you're not looking straight down, you're not solving the problems and you might hit some rocks, and that's going to stop you dead in the water, right? But if you're only focused on looking straight down, you're not actually looking at where you're going, right? You can't do both of these things at once. If you look straight ahead, then you can kind of see whether or not another boat is coming, in this case. Maybe another platform, maybe some users are being detractors, so on and so forth. But if you only look straight ahead, that's kind of the near future, you might get distracted and you might forget your why. Can you just flick to the next slide? So this is important because in the product world, we talk about pivoting. So I've done a very poor attempt at showing you what happens when you pivot without looking at your why. So imagine that this is the start, and this line is a direct line to your why. If you make no changes, you definitely don't need to pivot, but probably you've never spoken to your users. But let's say you've spoken to your users or you found some defects and you make a 1-degree pivot. And that pivot is the right thing to do in its moment, because every pivot is the right thing to do in its moment. You can see that if you continue on that trajectory without doing anything else, you will probably still hit your why. But if you make another pivot, slightly bigger pivot, let's call that a 5-degree pivot, and you don't look at your why, you will miss it. And these pivots, we do these pivots every day, every iteration, every month, every quarter, every year. And the bigger, if we don't kind of course correct, this is what we call course correcting, right? Then you will miss your purpose. And that's where people get really, really distracted. So this is why this is good, because there's all these objects going around, there's things trying to kill you all the time. But actually, if you kind of stick to, how do I get feedback from what's happening right now? How do I continue to look ahead to make sure I'm heading in generally the right direction? And how do I stay true to my purpose, right? To build what I think is the right thing to build. These things will help you build a really good platform.
Thanks very much for listening to us. Not taking questions, particularly from this guy over here. But
or these two.
I'll be happy to hang around, and we'll have a chat later on if you've got anything else you want to talk about.
Before I run off the stage, though, I don't want you to feel like this is a total, like this is a bit like the Innovators Dilemma. It is not a disaster. There's actually an entire community of people who have solved all of those problems already. They work in the digital services space, digital app space. That's what my team does, right? We really like putting digital and product thinking in spaces that it doesn't belong, like this. And so it might feel like everything that we've talked about can be a bit overwhelming, and you're like, fuck, like, people, right? But actually, there's a whole group of people who are willing to help. They've actually solved a bunch of these problems. They can give you a bunch of techniques that are pretty easily translatable to what I think you need to do. So yeah, come and talk to me and Dan, but help is out there.
Awesome. Thank you.